Welcome, and thank you for joining the Religious Freedom Institute for this discussion on America's international religious freedom policy and thinking about varying definitions of religion and the common good across societies. I'm Nathan Berkeley, RFI's Communications Director and Research Coordinator. RFI is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., and we are committed to achieving broad acceptance of religious liberty as a fundamental human right, a source of individual and social flourishing and the cornerstone of a successful society and a driver of national and international security. RFI seeks to advance religious freedom for everyone, everywhere. Today, we'll be talking about our recently published report titled America's International Religious Freedom Policy Must Account for Competing Local Definitions of Religion and the Common Good. This report was published as a part of RFI's Freedom of Religious Institutions and Society project, also known as FORIS. FORIS is a 3-year initiative funded by the John Templeton Foundation that aims to clarify the meaning and value of institutional religious freedom, examine how that freedom is faring globally, and explore why it is worthy of public concern. FORIS seeks to advance scholarship, inform policymakers, and influence cultural understandings on institutional religious freedom in the United States and around the world. Religious liberty is not an individual right alone, but rather includes the right of religious communities to gather in synagogues, churches, mosques, temples, and other houses of worship without undue interference from the state or threats from violent non-state actors. Freedom of religion also includes the right of faith communities to establish religious institutions such as schools, hospitals, ministries to the poor, universities, and countless others that seek to embody the teachings of their respective religious tradition. Institutional religious freedom encompasses this full range of congregational and organizational expressions of faith. Turning briefly to the report itself, in it, the authors argue that proponents of religious freedom who work in U.S. foreign affairs must carefully consider how conceptions of religion and the common good vary across countries. U.S. diplomats, policymakers, and advocates for religious liberty will be less effective if they don't give due attention to these differences as they are manifest across societies. In each country, this variation shapes public conversations and state policies about which religious communities receive legal recognition and rights, the appropriate degree of government intervention in religious affairs, how to balance ideals like liberty and social harmony, and how to determine the contours of institutional religious freedom in light of each of these factors. On that last point, the report takes the additional step of explicitly addressing issues of institutional religious freedom in recognition that securing the freedom of individuals to join one another based on their shared faith to form congregations, schools, social service organizations, and many more requires something different culturally and legally than that which is necessary to safeguard individual exercises of religion. The report then turns to providing a number of policy principles for U.S. officials to consider when advancing religious freedom abroad. For example, the report argues that policymakers should advocate boldly for the preservation and expansion of religious liberty for the largest number of individuals, communities, and institutions possible, while also urging the least intrusive and least coercive forms of religious regulation practicable, even in cultural contexts where social harmony is valued as much as, if not more than, religious liberty. The report sets forth a number of other policy principles that I will leave to Professor Chad Bauman, our moderator today, and our distinguished group of leading scholars to address. Chad is a professor in the Department of Philosophy, Religion, and Classics at Butler University in Indianapolis, and his research, writing, and teaching focus on the intersection of religion, law, and social conflict in South and Southeast Asia. And his most recent book, published last fall by Cornell University Press, is titled Anti-Christian Violence in India. Professor Bauman is also a scholar with RFI's FORIS project. He's a co-author of this report that we're discussing today, and you may find his full bio and that of all of our panelists on the event page on RFI's website. Chad, I will now turn it over to you to introduce our panelists and to kick off this important discussion.
It's an honor to be here with you and with our distinguished guests, and I'll introduce them before we begin. Robert Hefner is Professor of Global Affairs and Anthropology at the Pardee School of Global Affairs at Boston University. He is former president of the Association for Asian Studies and the current president of the American Institute for Indonesian Studies. The author or editor of more than 20 books, Bob has done research on Muslim culture, education, and politics for more than 30 years. He's a regular consultant to government and international foundations, and he is currently co-producing 6 documentary films on Islam, diversity, and citizenship in Indonesia. Our second guest is Jacqueline Neo. She is an associate professor and the director of the Center for Asian Legal Studies at the National University of Singapore, NUS, Faculty of Law. A graduate of the NUS Faculty of Law with an LLB and Yale Law School, LLM and JSD, she is the recipient of multiple academic scholarships, competitive research grants, and research awards. Jacqueline has published in leading journals and is the editor or co-editor of 5 books and 5 special issues in reputable journals. She has held visiting positions at Frankfurt University, University of Münster, University of Trento, Melbourne Law School, and the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, as well as the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Thanks both to Bob and Jacqueline for being with us during this session. We're going to follow a open question and answer format. I will pose initial questions to Bob and Jacqueline, but then of course, after one or the other concludes with their initial comments, we invite the other to weigh in and add as they see fit. So we'll get right into it. Bob, we'll aim the first question at you. Among the most basic premises of this policy report is that conceptions of religion, ideal or desirable religion, and the common good differ from context to context internationally, and that these differences naturally give rise to distinctive regimes of religious regulation or lack thereof. Could you give us a few examples of such differences and how they inform or give rise to different conceptions of religious liberty?
Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Nathan, Jacqueline. It's a pleasure to join you here today, this morning, and this evening in Singapore. I'll begin with not a specific example, but with a general example, which is that there's more than 150 some countries in which studies, very detailed studies, have been carried out on religious policy, religion-state relations. And in about 22% of countries around the world, there's one state religion. And in about 2/3 of the remainder, just under 2/3, either one or several religions are favored, even though you don't have a state religion. State policy with regard to education, funding of religious institutions goes disproportionately to one or several religions. Now, why do I mention this? So you have a pattern all around the world that's quite different from what, if you grow up in the United States of America, and or like me, if you've spent 30 years or so interacting with policy officials in Washington, D.C., you realize that there's an assumption that the kind of American pattern of religious diversity, where one can announce a religion, get tax exemption, and that's it. That is not the norm. In fact, America is unique in this regard. Most countries regulate religion first and foremost, first out of the gate, by identifying what traits are required to be recognized as a religion, and by extending official recognition as a religion to only a select number of countries. And that's what we see in European countries. As I said, 22% have a state religion, but of almost 2/3 extend the recognition as religion to just a handful of religion, typically those that conform to a Christian and Judeo-Christian ideal. So that pattern then gets replicated in different forms all around the world. In most Muslim, not all, but in most Muslim majority countries, what is identified as a religion is, again, something that a spiritual or religious tradition that in some sense conforms to Islamic notions of religiosity, notions which are very close to those of Judeo-Christianity, but which again, by emphasizing prophecy or some kind of religious seer, the presence and necessity of a holy book, a scripture, and things like that, they in effect leave out, in most instances, a large number of religious traditions that are practiced and recognized in a specific society. So you have not just an exception to the American pattern, but in fact, America is the great exception with regard to how we understand religion and the flexibility with which we will accept people's self-understandings as to what constitutes religion.
Great, thanks for that, Bob. Jacqueline, a slightly related question here. The report references Singapore frequently, and in particular talks about the significant importance given there to harmony relative to liberty. The same might be said with regard to other nations of Southeast Asia and even with regard to Asia more broadly. Could you talk a little bit more about religious harmony and how it could actually be conducive to religious freedom?
Right. Thank you, Chad. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And of course, for this particular report, which really is important in starting this conversation about differential understandings of religion, as well as highlighting the need for local knowledge, I would say. So thank you for this question about religious harmony. I think that there is, in some quarters, some prejudice about this idea of harmony, because harmony is often seen as a way to suppress freedom. It is seen as a claim for uniformity, and it is sometimes also seen as synonymous with more autocratic approaches towards the regulation of religion. So we do see in anthropology, for instance, the idea of harmony as a coercive form of state regulation, as a coercive form of not imposing certain norms on particular communities, especially marginalized communities. But I want to sort of expand our understanding of religion by sort of pointing to the fact that the idea of harmony itself can be subject to different conceptions. And I would just point to two. Firstly, one could see religious harmony as a precondition to freedom, in the sense that for us to actually be able to practice religion and practice religious freedom in a peaceable manner, one needs to be in a context where there is no conflict and there is no inter-religious hostility that prevents that type of freedom to be exercised. So we have to see religious harmony in some ways as a precondition for us to be able to expand and practice religion. Now, secondly, I think harmony can also obviously be seen as a limit on these freedoms, but it doesn't have to be the kind of limits where you have a totalizing suppression of freedom. Harmony can be a controlling principle for sensible, and I would say sensible hate speech laws, for instance, because certain forms of hate speech can, as the research does show, although I suppose the US is very much an outlier in this, but it has harm on the dignity of persons. It can have harmful effects on the way religion is being practiced. Now, I think harmony could be a controlling principle, although it must be constrained so as not for us to go all the way to the totalizing effect of harmony. In addition, we need to also think of harmony as a controlling principle for setting certain boundaries for acceptable behavior. So in my research on Singapore, I examined the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, which of course is not a perfect law. But if you think, but looking at the way the law has actually been used in Singapore, the key function of this law has been its ability to express boundaries of respectful behavior for religious groups, particularly religious leaders. So again, it's not to say that this is a perfect law, but the function, the expressivist function of this law, I think has a lot going for it. And it could actually point to the need for regulations that set these boundaries for respectful behavior, for respectful conduct of religion between, and for respectful engagement between religions.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm curious about how you might respond to one of the common criticisms of harmony. So oftentimes, particularly here in the United States, you will hear people say the problem with emphases on harmony is that it at least in minor ways, limits the free marketplace of ideas. And there's the presumption that it's from that free marketplace of ideas that progress comes, and that if we limit that free marketplace of ideas in any way by saying you can or can't say something, or you can't say something in a certain way, that something is lost, some possibility of human progress is lost. What might be the response of people who articulate the more sort of positive kinds of forms of regulation that you've described to such a potential criticism?
So that's a great point. Yes, I think that we need to guard against, as I mentioned, a total harmony being used as a totalizing ideology to suppress all religious practice or to impose some kind of uniformity in religious practice. However, I would say that the idea that we should allow for this free marketplace of ideas has its limitations. One, for instance, would be that allowing sort of, firstly, one has to question whether or not the lack of regulation really is even possible, because even if laws do not intentionally regulate religion, they do indirectly or incidentally regulate religion. So even if you don't have registration laws specifically for religious organizations, there still has to be some kind of registration rules for organizations, right? So that would be my first sort of comeback. The second really is that we have to see that oftentimes the lack of regulation actually, or if we allow this marketplace of ideas, oftentimes it just means that the loudest, the most established, the most powerful organizations, the ones with the greatest means and resources will actually emerge victorious. So the marketplace of ideas doesn't sufficiently protect against religious minorities, for instance. It doesn't protect against the more marginalized voices within a dominant religion. So, and it, in some ways, it also sort of marginalizes those who may seek to advance more progressive interpretations of the religion. So the fact that the idea that we could have a free marketplace of ideas in certain contexts would simply not work. So harmony itself then could be, I would say, a sensible approach to harmony would allow us to institute fair and proportionate regulation that would allow an expansion of freedom for many more groups.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Bob, I do have some more questions for you later, but I wonder if you have anything you'd like to add to what Jacqueline has just said.
Well, I think what Jacqueline said covered things very, very well. I'll go in a slightly different direction under the framework of thinking about harmony, but extending it a little bit just with some examples to underscore that when we talk about harmony, we're not just talking about relations between groups. We're also talking about the ways within the same religious tradition or the same religious community, different divergent values, diverse values, which may be in tension are readjust or reprioritized. Case in point, one that again might at first sight seem distant from questions of religious freedom, but it's not at all. And this has to do with the content, the curriculum of education in religious schools. Right now in Israel, and indeed for the last few years in Israel, we've seen a back and forth between ultra-Orthodox schools and the state. The state under Netanyahu in particular regarded the ultra-Orthodox community as allies, as friends, but at the same time, it sought to intervene in religious education so as to encourage, not to mandate, not to absolutely coerce, but to encourage the incorporation of secular and or general education, mathematics, hard sciences, history, into the curriculum. Now, I mentioned the example of Israel because the same process has taken place in many societies around the world. Buddhist majority, Christian majority, and then of course most recently, and the example that I'm most familiar with because I work on Islamic education, Muslim majority countries. In all of these societies, we have at certain moments seen state officials, if you will, challenging the notion of absolute freedom, the prioritization of absolute freedom as a paramount freedom and an unqualified freedom in favor of a slightly different balance, one that asserts the right of the state to recommend, and in some instances, depending upon the national tradition and or as in the United States, the state tradition, actually coerce or mandate a certain proportion of the school day being dedicated to general education. For many of us, myself included, I work on religious education. This is a good thing, but it at the same time reflects a tension in a kind of less familiar domain than that of blasphemy laws, a tension between different kinds of values, a tension that, if you will, appears in many, many religious traditions, including very dramatically those of the Christian majority or Christian legacy West.
Thanks, Bob. Jacqueline, let's come back to you for a second. We've talked a little bit about harmony, but I wonder whether you could talk about other distinctive features of countries in Asia with regard to religious liberty, conceptions of religion in the common good, that you think policymakers in the United States should pay attention to when advocating for religious liberty.
Right. So I agree with what Bob have raised so far. And I think that if we were to look at Asia, it's important to see that the history of state-religion relations is very distinct from, let's say, the Anglo-European history. And the configurations of state-religion relations that, and a lot of times our scholarship actually is premised upon that very Eurocentric, Anglo-Eurocentric history of this tussle and struggle between church and state. But that hasn't been the case in countries in Asia. We have very distinctive histories with religion. And those distinctive histories, I think, have to be taken into account in sort of advancing or advocating for certain changes in laws and regulations in order to advance religious freedom. Now, that would be the first. The second, I think, is an understanding of the different religious demographics that we have, because we're not talking about sectarian conflicts in some of these countries. We're talking about actually interreligious. So there are interreligious sort of tensions as well as intra-religious tensions, and these configurations are different in different South Asian countries. If you look at East Asia, you have a very different sort of state-religion relations and a very different religious demographic configuration. You look at Southeast Asia, you look at South Asia, very vastly different types of configurations. So there cannot be a one-size-fits-all definition of religion and a one-size-fits-all approach to advancing religious freedom, simply because the kind of tensions, intra-religious issues, state religion configuration that we see across these different countries vastly differ. I can't even say that there is an Asian approach to any of these, right? And thirdly, I think to some extent we do see a sort of great diversity of political configurations and political regimes across the region as well. You have a very sort of communist socialist, you have some communist socialist regimes, you have some more sort of communitarian, some say authoritarian type semi-competitive democracies. You have countries that privilege religion, as Bob raised earlier, and they privilege this in a very constitutionalized way. And in Asia, we have one of the absolute monarchies, right? Brunei is an absolute monarchy. So you can't use the same sort of solutions or policies to address religious freedom issues in Brunei as you would in different countries like Singapore. So I think understanding that there are different histories of state-religion relations, different demographics, and sort of these configurations actually differ across the region, and understanding that there are different political regimes that we are dealing with, all these need to go into the sort of formulation of what policy recommendations one should come up with when trying to advance religious freedom in Asia?
Thank you, Jacqueline. A question here for Bob. I think you and Jacqueline have done well here to establish the existence of these fundamental differences in conceptions of religion and the common good around the world, and the way that they influence the formulation of regimes of regulation of religion. And Jacqueline has helpfully pointed us to these different historical trajectories that give rise to different kinds, not only of government formulation, but also of policy formulation. So I think we can take this as acknowledged fact here that there are these differences. So in general terms, what does the existence of these fundamental differences mean for how policymakers in the United States should advocate for religious liberty abroad if they hope to be successful?
Well, that's a great question. And it's a question that I have often been asked in the State Department and then in international NGO settings. And I think the first principle is the principle of respect, but a respect that isn't mere tolerance and kind of abnegation of any kind of intervention, but policymakers, particularly here we're talking about US policymakers, would do well to begin their advocacy of certain policies when they deal with state officials in different countries by, first of all, identifying, taking some time and learning something about local conceptions of religion and trying to understand how much those look like and how much those differ from American conceptions. So begin with a kind of respectful engagement. It doesn't mean one has to, it's a different deferential engagement, but a respectful engagement in the very least of identifying what the tradition and what is identified as religion within that particular national tradition, a national tradition which, as Jacqueline said so well, differs quite significantly around the world. Secondly, because we're not asking for, this is a Religious Freedom Institute, and we're not, again, deferring on the commitment to religious freedom, but we're encouraging, if you will, instruments, interventions, and appeals that are effective. And they're effective precisely because, having identified how religion in general and religion in specific cases is understood in different national settings, you then, as a policymaker, you take a look at the lay of the land, identify the major social groupings both within and outside of government that have a likely commitment or an already established commitment to something that bears, if I can use the phrase, a kind of family resemblance to our notion, or the notion of religious freedom that we wish to support. And having identified those, then we can engage those parties, again, always, of course, recognizing we do so within the kind of limitations of nation states, but engage those parties once again in a way that, rather than kind of laying down the gauntlet, though that may at times be necessary in times of extreme injustice, but in most instances, a more effective policy begins again with identifying those varied understandings of religion, and secondly, working with and appealing to those actors, those groupings, those NGOs, those government agencies that are already, if you will, heading in the direction of some kind of practical as well as principled commitment to, again, something that bears a family resemblance, hopefully strong family resemblance, to notions of religious freedom.
Thanks, Bob. A follow-up for Jacqueline. The report argues against an quote, entrenched assumption in some religious freedom discourse that any state regulation is inimical to religious liberty, end quote. Do you agree with this? And if so, could you elaborate on how applying this libertarian lens may hamper foreign policy efforts to advance religious liberty?
Right, thank you. So thank you. So this builds on something I mentioned earlier, which is the idea that when we have, so firstly, questioning whether or not it is possible to have a completely free market, non-lack of regulation. And I think that that's not actually possible. And the second point is that, which is that we have to understand that the lack of regulation, or rather the seeming lack of regulation, oftentimes promotes, or rather entrenches, a status quo. And that status quo would be one that favors the majority, one that favors the more powerful within society. So I think that what we really need is a way of thinking about regulation in a sensible way. To think about how do we have proportionate and fair regulation that could advance and protect religious minorities, and to protect those who are dissenters within even majority or established religions, right? And to really get out of this mindset that somehow we can magic up religious harmony, religious freedom for all by just removing all forms of restrictions. Now, for instance, I've sort of briefly mentioned registration laws, right? Now, one could say, and in some sort of some scholarship, there's this idea that we cannot have any regulation of religion. So if you have any registration laws that apply to religious groups, that actually would be seen as restricting religious freedom. But one could say that in some countries, the fact that they come up with clear and accessible rules for religious organizations to actually attain legal personality, that actually could be a way to advance religious freedom, because this means that they have a way of registering, becoming legal entities, and holding property, and to keep a register of members so as to organize themselves in a way that could allow them to grow. So the very fact that you have rules allowing for registration may, and if you thought about regulation, this as a form of regulation and therefore as a restriction on religious freedom, you wouldn't be able to sort of fully appreciate the fact that in some countries, this is actually a way to advance religious freedom, because it is a way for religious organizations to actually operate legally and to expand their activities. So again, this goes back to the idea that we have to understand regulations also in a contextual manner to see what these regulations are actually doing on the ground and what do they actually change for religious organizations, for religious believers, and not just see all forms of regulation as inimical to religious freedom.
Thank you, Jacqueline. You've raised an issue here, which I think the report does address, that I think is important, which is that it's not just religious minorities that are sometimes disadvantaged by overly repressive religious regulation, but also sometimes the minorities within the majority. And sometimes, if we think only of minorities, we're not really taking the full picture into account. Either Bob or Jacqueline, could you just say a little bit more about that dynamic, the way that in certain contexts, we actually see that minorities within the religious majority are restricted more than religious minorities themselves?
Jacqueline, you want to take first crack?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, we can, it's a great question, and there are many examples of ways in which, if you will, a kind of majoritarianism, majoritarianism on matters of religion and religious policy, state policies on religion, disadvantages not just minorities who are associated with what are regarded as entirely different traditions, but as sub-traditions within each religious tradition. We're familiar with this, of course, in the United States setting, with the Church of the Latter-day Saints, and the way in which, over the course of the 19th century, many Americans particularly Protestant Christian Americans, were reluctant to extend rights and privileges of religious freedom to a community that I self-identified as Christian, but which many in the Christian community did not regard as legitimately or authentically Christian. If we fast forward to today's world, we see a similar controversy raging. Let me again begin a little bit far afield. In Buddhist majority countries, in places like South and Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, where we all know that in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, there's been a very, very harsh repression of the Muslim minority, which in both cases is very small, but has become a kind of icon or symbol in the minds of Buddhist ultranationalists of a kind of an other that is unacceptable to the national model, the national imaginary, and its associated notions of citizenship. But interestingly, and in some ways necessarily, in moving against distinct others like the Muslim minority in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, the Buddhist ultranationalists, the hyper-nationalists who play a very significant role in both countries, have had at the same time to target people within the Buddhist community who say, no, this discrimination against people who profess another religious tradition is un-Buddhist. It's contrary to the Buddhist teachings. And that difference has not been just a matter of, if you will, intellectual disagreement. It has been followed up by systematic persecution and marginalization of, if you will, this more inclusive understanding of Buddhism in both countries. Last but not least, we know that in Muslim majority countries, particularly since the 1970s, so it's been going on for almost a half century, and indeed it has roots that go back further, minority professions of Islam, not least of all the Ahmadis, who emerged in the 19th century in what is today Pakistan and northern India. There has been a systematic movement that's gained momentum since the 1970s to disqualify, to disesteem, to delegitimate Ahmadis as Muslims at all. Now, we as outsiders defer, if you will, on matters of religious principle to the community in question. But at the same time, we as policymakers, as social scientists, we can see that this, if you will, policy has opened a kind of slippery slope to debates, for example, in Sunni majority countries, including in Malaysia, for example. Not so in its neighboring country, Indonesia, but in Malaysia, the Shia minority, which is present, has been not just disesteemed, but, if you will, defined as illegitimate and non-Islamic. In neighboring Indonesia, the largest Muslim majority country in the world, I'm happy to say this kind of slippery slope has been avoided. But at the same time, nonetheless, certain, not just the Ahmadis, but certain non-conventional, non-mainstream practices of Islam have been disesteemed. Last but not least, in the case of Turkey, a great country, a country with its rich legacy of religious plurality, but also pluralism within the Muslim community. We've seen for the last 50 years an effort not just to disesteem, but to delegitimate the 22% of the Turkish population that professes a non-standard variety of Islam that is known as Alevism. So this is a problem that is pervasive around the world, and it's one that again merits the attention of policymakers and scholars.
Jacqueline, I've got a question for you, but I want to also leave you time to respond or add to what Bob has said if you'd like.
Right. So I think Bob has raised very important issues, and I think at the very least, I think we have to perhaps disentangle sectarian sort of conflicts within sort of particular religions and religious nationalism. I think they oftentimes work hand in hand, because what they want is to identify what is considered to be the pure or the right way of practicing religion the right form of orthodoxy and try to exclude others from that sort of orthodoxy, or to sort of force others to conform to that orthodoxy. But I think the sort of sectarian type conflict and the religious nationalism, while they work together, they do sort of respond to slightly different and sort of dynamics. In religious nationalism, at least in what we see, there is this idea that there is this intertwining, or rather oftentimes conflation, of a political identity with a religious identity. And in doing so, anyone who is outside of that religious identity is then seen as the enemy, as the other. So this othering is happening not just against those who don't conform to their orthodoxy, but also against those who do not belong to that religious identity. So when we have religious nationalism, that creates a very exclusivist approach towards law, towards policy, and towards the idea of who is or is not part of the nation. And that often, and we do see this dynamic sort of expanding in certain parts of Asia. I think Bob sort of raised some of them. We see this in Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar, Buddhist nationalism in some ways sort of coming to fore in Sri Lanka. We see Malay Muslim nationalism, where there's this intertwining of ethnic identity with the religious identity coming to fore to make claims as to who represents the nation. And this then creates its own sort of dynamics of exclusion and potential violence. We see Hindu nationalism rising up in India, for instance. So understanding the sources of the exclusionary dynamics within a country is very important, because are we talking about sectarian conflict? Are we talking about theological disagreements? Or are we talking about also religious nationalism, where we are trying, where there are groups trying to claim who is part of the nation and who is not part of the nation? And so understanding these sources of exclusions and the propensity to create conflict within these different countries, I think that would be something policymakers need to be very careful about. And I also wanted to sort of piggyback on something Bob said earlier. I think it's important to work with communities, not just with governments, but to understand within the community the different, and to work with community leaders on their understanding of religion and their needs as to how to advance religious freedom for them. So working with communities would, I think, be crucial in helping to advance our understandings of religious freedom.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And your comments there right at the end provide a really natural segue to the final question I wanted to ask. And I wanted you both to weigh in, but since you were just talking, we'll give you a break, let Bob weigh in first, and then hopefully we can hear from you at the end. So one of the report's key recommendations is that, quote, any effort to promote individual and institutional religious freedom in a specific national setting must begin with a careful mapping of the movements and coalitions most intent on and capable of consolidating religious freedom in a socially effective way. That's very similar to what you just said, Jacqueline. That's the end of the quote. Bob, could you say a little bit more from your perspective about what that might mean in practice and why it is so important?
It's important, first of all, because, as Jacqueline said, and as I said in a slightly different way earlier, all societies and all religious traditions carry within them multiple currents. And those currents often are distinguished today with regard to the matters that we're talking about here, the very definition of religion, and indeed the understanding of what is required for a society, for a people and a religious community to flourish, what concepts of public good. One of the interesting characteristics of modern societies, and one that I think policymakers must be policymakers and social scientists must be attentive to is this diversity. And the fact that it's not just a diversity that exists there, but if you will, by creating certain ground rules for public discourse, public participation, what, you know, in the philosophical wing of political theory is called the public sphere. By creating those ground rules, you allow voices and opinions and insights to be put forth on grounds other than that they reflect the majority. And that in some ways, whether in some ways then policymakers committed to the promotion of this combination of individual and institutional religious freedom that we're talking about today, policymakers can most encourage this, not just by dealing with governments, exactly as Jacqueline said. She said, it's not just state policymakers, but also by encouraging state officials and societal movements, organizations, social welfare associations, if you will, to be allowed to participate in as much as they recognize the rules for participation in a civil, engaging rather than exclusive and absolutist way. So you create, if you will, not too much perhaps an absolute free market of ideas, but you create something even in a society that may be struggling with internal tensions, internal divides, or a legacy of religious violence. You create, if you will, a culture. Democracy has to be culture making. It's not just procedural in the state. It has to be culture making in society. And a critical part of that cultural making to which policymakers can, and I think do pay attention, is encouraging a kind of respectful dialogue of a plurality of opinions, again, at the same time as in doing so, underscoring a commitment to a civil, respectful dialogue and engagement rather than, if you will, just the statement of an absolute truth or conviction.
Thanks, Bob. Jacqueline, anything you want to add there?
Right. So I wanted to say that at the end of your report, I really like this idea of advocating for humility and not passivity, but humility. I think that is important. I don't think any one of us have the ability to understand how things work in every part of the world to the fullest extent. So working with local communities would be very important. Now, working with local communities and the advancement of religious freedom doesn't actually always have to take this form of, we are advocating for religious freedom, this is how you do it, and so on. It doesn't always have to be prescriptive, but it sometimes can be much more effective to go on the ground and support them in different ways, whether this is through some kind of, infrastructure support or just of being able to be in conversation with some of these local communities. I think that sort of going together and working with people would be effective, could be more effective in some jurisdictions. I think that's one. And I think we have to understand that at least in certain countries, we are grappling with legacies of colonialism and legacies of imperialism. And so this counseling of humility is very important because you don't want to be seen as this savior coming in to impose your ideas of what religion and religious freedom entails. I think that idea of humility is spot on in terms of allowing for effective engagement that could really bring about change on the ground. But of course, this also means that change could actually come, more incrementally and maybe more gradually. But I think this, as of something Bob says, you have to build a culture, and building a culture of democracy building a culture of freedom and respect takes much more effort, but I think has more lasting effects.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And thanks to both you, Jacqueline, and Bob for being willing to be put on the spot here. Let me try to tie up some of the loose ends here since we have come to the end of our session. For first, from my perspective, one of the key lines in the report, well, actually two key lines. One that Jacqueline just named, that we advocate for humility, not passivity. And the second one is that we argue for humility, not relativism, and for a willingness to make, rather than merely presume, the argument for religious liberty as imagined in the United States. That's a quote from the report. For me, that line identifies a significant tension and a challenge in advocacy for religious liberty. There is no Archimedean point from which we can survey the landscape of religious liberty and make pronouncements on what is desirable and undesirable in all times and places. Going back to some of the things Jacqueline said about we have democracies, we have monarchies, we have authoritarian governments. There is no one size fits all. So one must, by definition, begin where one is, working with the cultural presumptions and ideals of the space that one inhabits. But this doesn't mean that one can say nothing about matters elsewhere. It simply means that one must recognize that others will begin the conversation working with different cultural presumptions and ideals that may lead them to different and sometimes surprising conclusions about how best to regulate religion. A second point I would make that emerges from that first one is that because of these differences, any productive conversation about religious liberty and the regulation of religion must begin by naming and addressing these fundamental cross-cultural differences in conceptions about religion and the common good. One can't simply begin by advocating for a particular policy or regime of religious regulation. One must begin instead by addressing and trying to arrive at some understanding or even consensus on notions of religion, ideal religion, religious liberty, and the common good. Then, and only then, can one move on to a discussion of how such ideals might be best achieved and reflected in public policy. And then finally, I would say, among the report's major recommendations, and perhaps the one that has been least pursued, and therefore the one that requires the most future work, is the one that we just discussed right at the end there. This quote, I'll quote again: "Any effort to promote individual and institutional religious freedom in a specific national setting must begin with a careful mapping of the movements and coalitions most intent on and capable of consolidating religious freedom in a socially effective way." That's the end of the quote. Importantly, in my mind, this recommendation recognizes the plurality of social actors that impinge both upon religious liberty legislation and upon the manner in which such legislation is enacted or not in society. Perfectly good religious liberty policies can be undermined by social organizations that don't respect them or don't respect religious liberty for others. Similarly, efforts to develop desirable protections for religious liberty will be undermined if they are articulated in socially unacceptable or suspicious or questionable ways. So policymakers would therefore do well to identify and work, as Jacqueline said, with the local social movements and coalitions that not only care about religious liberty, but also know instinctively how to move the needle on such issues in socially appropriate and effective ways. So we'll have to end there with much more still to discuss. We invite those listening in to read the full policy report, which can be found on the website of the Religious Freedom Institute. Links will be provided here at the end of the session. Thanks to Nathan again for encouraging this conversation, Bob and Jacqueline for being willing to be in the hot seat and participate in it, and all of you for helping organize and agreeing to be part of this panel. And thanks to all of you who have joined in to listen to this discussion. We hope to continue the conversation and we welcome your feedback. So thanks again. And with that, we will conclude.
Thank you.